Are you confused about meat and animal products and whether they increase your risk of disease? We've all seen the headlines.
Do we know what causes heart disease?
So meat and dairy, you're gonna die if you eat like that.
The fats and red meats in diet, come on, so complicated.
Animal protein.
Red meat contains nutrients.
Enough protein, enough iron.
Could be linked to cancer.
And maybe you've heard about the 2019 Global Burden of Disease report claiming the safe level of red meat intake is essentially zero. Or the Eat Lancet diet, urging us to eat no more than 14 grams of red meat per day, which is about the size of a strawberry. The meat is harmful narrative is loud and pervasive. Yet while the negative effects of animal products are often presented in the headlines as a consensus, when you peel back the research, you'll find that it's not as clear-cut as you might think. Animal products contain essential nutrients like protein, iron, zinc, and vitamin A that reduce the risk of nutrient deficiency and disease, and even nutrients that we can't get anywhere else, like vitamin B12. And in a world where 11 million deaths worldwide each year are diet-related, clearing up the confusion is crucial. So in today's video, we're going to take a look at the big picture and attempt to answer the million-dollar question. Do animal products and meat actually cause diseases like heart disease and cancer? Or might there be other dietary factors driving our increased rates of disease? I think you can agree. It's time we take a closer look. It's time we rethink meat and disease.
Red meat's been copying a lot of bad
Saturated fat, cholesterol, animal protein.
Plant-based
Cutting down on red meat
every day if you want to be healthy.
We're just seeing what people on the street think about meat and cholesterol and saturated fat.
Red meat is
terrible for your health.
it's not good.
Clogs your arteries,
I'm plant-based.
ruins your heart.
yummy. Damn it, that's not healthy.
Red meat.
Red meat
Red meat
Yeah, red meat is delicious.
is full of protein.
is good for you.
Well, saturated fat is terrible for you.
Cholesterol is not good. You want to keep that down.
You want to watch that?
I want my heart beating as long as it wants to, and that would slow it down.
It's in all the medical journals.
I should keep an eye out, like my doctor is always telling me to do.
If you ask someone on the street why animal products are harmful, they'll likely tell you that the cholesterol and saturated fat can clog your arteries and increase your risk of heart disease. I sat down with New York Times best-selling author Nina Teicholz about exactly where this idea originated.
President Eisenhower had a heart attack in 1955, and out of the Oval Office, the whole nation's attention is focused on what causes heart disease, and there is no answer. And into that void steps Ancel Keys with his idea, the diet heart hypothesis, that it's saturated fat and cholesterol that cause heart disease. Ancel Keys then, is able to promote his idea into the American Heart Association. He joins their nutrition committee and is able to get them to endorse his idea. And really the first advice anywhere in the world telling people to avoid saturated fat and cholesterol as their primary means of prevention against heart disease came out in the American Heart Association, published in 1961. I mean, that is the beginning of the whole cascade of policies that are now global today.
Cholesterol, a chemical found in all
builds
animal
up in the
fats.
blood vessels that lead to the heart.
He had a coronary when he was 46.
Generation of heart attack victims.
This artery is from the body of a person who has just died from heart disease.
And it could well be because of what we're allowing them to eat.
Food.
Cholesterol is increased as a result of fats in the diet, cholesterol in the food.
Cholesterol. It's in egg yolks.
Eggs are eliminated
and
because of the
fish like
cholesterol.
these, ground beef, steak, bacon, ham,
Meaning
and
a risk
hot
of
dog.
trouble later in life.
Cholesterol.
Cholesterol for some people, dietary cholesterol, is a nutrient of concern and something to be limited. What are your thoughts on that?
Dietary cholesterol, unbeknownst to pretty much everybody, is no longer a nutrient of concern. If you go back in time, you will see that even in the late 1970s, there was a growing awareness that this belief that dietary cholesterol in egg yolk, shellfish, that it was bad for health, could not be shown to be true. But it took until 2015 that our dietary guidelines, our official policy, reviewed the data on dietary cholesterol, even though they had been recommending to cap it for decades at that point. And they said they found insufficient evidence that dietary cholesterol is a problem for your serum cholesterol or for heart disease.
If you've been paying attention lately, you might have heard that dietary cholesterol has been vindicated. It turns out only 20% of the cholesterol in your bloodstream comes from the food you eat. The remaining 80% is naturally produced by your body. When we eat less, our bodies make more, and vice versa. According to Harvard School of Public Health, scientific studies show a weak relationship between the amount of cholesterol a person consumes and his or her blood cholesterol levels. Now, there is a group of people called hyperresponders who respond more dramatically, but for most people, dietary cholesterol does not seem to be a concern. But what about saturated fat?
I can't believe you mentioned fat.
Comforting fat.
But if you choose low fat or the skim milk dairy products,
High in cholesterol and saturated fat.
That modern man in the United States is in grave danger from obesity.
you need meat as a garnish, and carbohydrate should actually be your main course.
Contain saturated fats.
Saturated fat is often considered harmful because of its association with cholesterol. But if dietary cholesterol is not as big of an issue as once believed, is there still a reason to fear saturated fat? Though historically, many Americans were taught to fear fat, natural dietary fats are essential for energy production, vitamin absorption, and cell membrane and hormone production. When we don't have enough fats, we become nutrient deficient, causing symptoms like skin issues and hair loss, slow wound healing, and a weakened immune system. During the 70s and 80s, it was widely believed that saturated animal-based fats were worse for health than plant-based unsaturated fatty acids. And in 1977, the diet heart hypothesis went public when the McGovern report urged Americans to swap saturated fats for unsaturated fats like vegetable oils in the interest of their health. But even at this time, many scientists were skeptical, given that historical accounts, evolutionary evidence, and even randomized controlled trials did not support this. In fact, the lack of scientific evidence is something one of the creators of the report, Senator McGovern, admitted himself.
I have pleaded in my report and will plead again orally here for more research on the problem before we make announcements to the American public.
Well, I would only argue that senators don't have the luxury that a research scientist does of waiting until every last shred of evidence is in.
Surprisingly, in 2016, researchers uncovered two large studies on saturated fat and unsaturated fat and their effects on cholesterol and disease from the late 60s and early 70s that should have been available to McGovern at the time of these guidelines, but were never fully reported. They were the Sydney Diet Heart Study and the Minnesota Coronary Experiment.
The largest trial of the Ansel-Keys hypothesis, and it took place in pretty well-controlled setting in 5 mental hospitals in Minnesota, or where they could control what people ate. When they completed the study, they didn't publish the results for 17 years.
Why?
Well, they could not find what they hoped to. They did not find that the people who lowered their saturated fat were spared death or heart attacks. In fact, the more the men lowered their cholesterol, the more likely they were to die from a heart attack. When they did publish them, they put them in a kind of out-of-the-way journal, and when asked why, much later, the lead investigator, Ivan France, said, well, we were just so disappointed in the way it turned out.
Why were these researchers disappointed? Dr. Ivan France was a close colleague of Ansel Keys, and his findings did not support Keys' diet heart hypothesis. It wasn't until France passed away and the entirety of the Minnesota Coronary Experiment data was uncovered in a box in his basement that we learned the truth. Several other trials have revealed a reduction in saturated fats provides no real benefit, like the Oslo Diet Heart Study, the Women's Health Initiative, the Medical Research Council Study, Mr. Fit trial, and more. Some of these trials also noted a worrisome increase in the risk of cancer for those consuming seed oils. Even the American College of Cardiology concluded that whole-fat dairy, unprocessed meat, and dark chocolate are saturated fatty acid-rich foods with a complex matrix that are not associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease. The totality of the available evidence does not support further limiting the intake of such foods. Sadly, Americans' dietary guidelines have not yet followed suit. In 2020, the 9th edition of Dietary Guidelines for Americans was released and recommended saturated fat should not make up more than 10% of one's total calories. Why? It was because the committee decided only to consider research done by the USDA and no one else, consciously limiting their data.
The U.S. Department of Agriculture, which is the main administrator of the dietary guidelines, they have partnerships with virtually maybe like 100 different food companies, including all the large multinational food companies. We found that 95% of everyone on the expert committee for the most recent guidelines in 2020 had at least one tie with the food or pharmaceutical industries.
As these guidelines were being published, a group of nutrition scientists, 2 of whom served on a prior dietary guidelines committee, wrote a letter to the USDA in an effort to draw attention to the lack of evidence supporting the limiting of saturated fat. They wrote, "There is no evidence that current population-wide upper limits on commonly consumed saturated fats in the United States will prevent cardiovascular disease or reduce mortality."
There have now been more than 20 review papers in the peer-reviewed literature by separate scientific teams from all over the world looking at this data they didn't even know existed from the 60s and 70s, and they have almost universally concluded that saturated fats are not associated with heart disease and that they have no effect on cardiovascular or total mortality. So eating saturated fats does not cause heart disease, according to the best available scientific literature.
As I think you'll agree, there are many reasons to doubt the fact that saturated fat from animal sources is dangerous, and it's clear that we cannot rely on our government committees to consider all research. So cholesterol and saturated fat are not the health destroyers we've been led to believe they are. But what about the headlines you've seen about red meat causing cancer?
Doctors have been telling us for years that red meat and processed foods can cause cancer.
Cancer is the second biggest killer in the United States.
Classified processed meats as a carcinogen for links to stomach and colorectal
Cut
cancers.
down on meat, rate of
Diet
breast
and cancer.
As you might have guessed, there are many reasons to doubt this too. One of the most influential reports suggesting red meat causes cancer was written by the World Health Organization, where they deemed fresh meat a possible carcinogen and processed meat a probable carcinogen, which sounds really scary when you read it as a headline. But what most people don't realize is that these meats fall into risk categories alongside air, leather, dust, hot beverages, and sitting near a sunny window. Dr. David Clearfield, a nutrition scientist at the USDA and a member of the World Health Organization's working group that created the 2015 guidelines, spoke out about it on a podcast with Brian Sanders.
Having been on the World Health Organization working group that evaluated processed and red meat and risk of cancer. That was the most frustrating professional experience of my life.
Noting that only 18 out of 800 trials were considered and there was not a scientific consensus. This is a perfect example of how unsettled science becomes a worldwide belief, which is why I sat down with functional medicine expert and New York Times bestselling author Dr. Chris Kresser to discuss what the best available science has to say about the link between red meat and disease.
Is there research, good quality research, to suggest that red meat is actually dangerous?
No, not in the context of a whole foods diet. Context is everything. If you're talking about is red meat harmful in the context of a standard American diet where you're eating it in between a bun with refined flour and with French fries processed with industrially refined seed oils and then washing it down with a 32-ounce big gulp of soda, it may be actually in that context. But when you're eating it in the context of a whole foods diet with fruits and vegetables, potatoes, nuts and seeds and things like that, there's really no evidence at all that red meat is harmful, and there's quite a bit of evidence that it's an extremely beneficial food because of its nutrient density and bioavailable protein.
Now I know that may surprise you given what we hear in the headlines, so let's dig into some of the most comprehensive science about the actual risks of red meat with a groundbreaking paper published in Nature in October of 2022 that looked at unprocessed red meat and 6 health outcomes.
Did find very weak evidence of an association between unprocessed red meat and colorectal, breast cancer, heart disease, and diabetes, but the devil's always in the details with these kinds of studies. So if we take a closer look, the researchers assign what's called a risk outcome score, or ROS, and the ROS reflects the certainty of evidence for a given risk factor. So a higher ROS corresponds to a very strong relationship, and a weaker or lower ROS corresponds to a weaker relationship. So the ROS for colorectal cancer was 0.057. For breast cancer, it was 0.027. For heart disease, 0.01, and type 2 diabetes was 0.005. So aside from those numbers being extremely low, let me give you some context. The ROS for cigarette smoking and cancer of the throat is 1.56. So that's 27 times higher than the ROS for red meat and colorectal cancer, and 312 times higher than the ROS for red meat and type 2 diabetes. I mean, not even on the same scale.
In other words, there was evidence of an association, but the size of that effect was tiny compared to well-established risk factors, and it might even be ignored in other areas of science. Not to mention that the largest and most comprehensive trial to date on this subject also found very low quality evidence of a link between red meat and any negative health outcome.
If you're gonna say that red meat is bad, good luck. Because this is the most comprehensive study that's ever been done, and it failed to find sufficient evidence against red meat.
But despite this solid science, in 2019, a report that informs policy and lawmakers regarding risk factors that affect global health, called the Global Burden of Disease Report, stated that a safe level of red meat intake is 0. To understand this contradiction, I talked to food scientist and scientific advisor, Dr. Frederic Leroy, who published a criticism of this report.
There's a new release now, and there's a fundamental change compared to the previous release. So the previous release was based on data obtained in 2017. And red meat was part of the risk factors, but it was a tiny little effect. I think it was the least or among the least important dietary effects that they were summarizing. And then suddenly, with the new data obtained in 2019, and certainly changed the whole picture. And that little effect was multiplied with a factor of 40. In the 2017 version, it was 23 grams per day per person. And that suddenly was set at 0. So the implication of that is that every little bite of red meat is now to be considered as a harmful act. You know, it's toxic by definition.
And such a dramatic change must be justified scientifically, right? Well, according to Dr. Leroy, it was not.
And there's absolutely no scientific evidence for that. They claim that they have done a new meta-analysis, but they haven't provided that evidence. And that's completely in contrast with what they're supposed to do. So we wrote a letter to the Lancet saying that this is problematic. While answering, they essentially said that that there were indeed problems with their analysis. They admitted that. They admitted a couple of things. And then they also said, well, we're going to fix that in our next edition. But that's not good enough. While the global burden of disease is still influencing policies, and while it's still being cited in academic papers, it essentially should not be in the scientific literature. It's a problematic study, and it would need retraction.
The way science progresses is in fits and starts. It's always a back and forth. You learn the literature, you learn the back and forth and the arguments, and you figure out where the truth is. Whenever you see things going all one way, your skepticism should go way up.
I think you get my point so far. It simply does not make sense that an ancient food is causing modern day disease. But our rates of disease are clearly rising. So which dietary factors should we be focused on? What foods are likely driving our increased rates of disease? A 2022 analysis of USDA data revealed that over the last 100 to 200 years, red meat consumption has declined by 21%, fluid and cream dairy has declined by 48%, and lard consumption has declined by 78%. In other words, as our rates of obesity and chronic disease have risen, we've actually been eating less of many of the animal products often blamed. So what are we eating more of? According to this report, margarine consumption has increased by 192%, shortening has increased by 91%, cooking oils have increased by 329%, artificial sweeteners by 1,227%, grain availability has increased by 41%, and overall calories by 18%. And even though many people are still under the impression that we should be cutting back on animal fats, experts are beginning to acknowledge that the low-fat diet recommendations to Americans may have done more harm than good. Sylvan Lee Weinberg, former president of the American College of Cardiology, stated that the low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet may well have played an unintended role in the current epidemics of obesity, lipid abnormalities, type 2 diabetes, and metabolic syndrome. This diet can no longer be defended by appeal to the authority of prestigious medical organizations. The simple takeaway is this: do not fear whole foods we have been eating for millions of years, like animal fats and red meat, but do avoid and be wary of processed foods, refined sugar, and man-made fats that have not yet passed the test of time.
I'm more skeptical about things that entered our diets recently. I like the test of time. That's why the whole argument for red meat doesn't make any sense. It's those foods that in the last 3, 4, 5 generations maximum, those foods that came in created the Western disease spectrum. I mean, there's something with those foods.
When looking at the totality of the evidence, meat, saturated fat, and cholesterol are not the dietary villains they made it out to be, and it's far more likely that excess carbohydrates, calories, and newly created highly processed foods and fats are to blame. Thank you for taking the time to look past the headlines today so you can have a deeper understanding of how meat can affect your health.